How much time needs to pass before grave robbing turns into archaeology? There's also a methodology component to it. Regardless of the age of the remains, if I wobble up with a metal detector, dig a hole and yank out anything of value, that's grave robbing. If I fight for months for planning approval, record every detail of the site in obsessive detail, then refill any holes carefully when the funding has run out even though there's still more to discover, that's archaeology. Plus archaeology's not just graves. I actually had to look this up once for reasons. It's 100 years or when the deceased has no remaining living relatives, whichever comes first. In North America, archaeologists have to be extremely careful with any kind of Native American burial. Nowadays it's more and more common that archaeologists might get a chance to look at a burial but they put it back in place as best as they can when they're done. So they study the burial but take nothing from it. This is because the living ancestors of these ancient people still like to honor their dead. The vast majority of archaeology undertaken is developer-led, meaning the site is only being dug because it's going to be developed for housing, industry, quarrying, etc. The site is essentially going to be trashed. There is no possibility of putting things back because the site will be built on and the ground irretrievably altered by heavy machinery. Full archaeological excavation is generally seen as a last resort where preservation in situ isn't possible. The idea of excavation for excavation's sake is a bit old-fashioned these days, and most reputable archaeologists would agree that it's better to leave things in the ground as they are rather than disturb them for no reason. In Beijing, when they were digging their public train subway lines, they found a bunch of prehistoric humans and their artifacts. Today, the stop in question, Wangfujing, has a small Paleolithic museum composed of objects they found on the site. I found it by accident when I visited over a decade ago. It's nestled into a shopping plaza. A 5-minute museum, sorry, but this is just one room with a few bones and rocks, found when they excavated for the shopping center. So if you need a 5-minute distraction from shopping, pop in, but don't travel to see. It's cool, but I can understand that disappointment if you didn't know. I still think it's an awesome way for them to have done it though. I guess you can say the answer is buried somewhere in this thread. I don't have an award but I wish I did. Here now you do. Madman. Please Google Kennewick Man. Could be thousands of years depending on the relatives. Interestingly, see the Iceman also has living relatives. Around 19 in Austria. It's possible one of these men is a direct descendant, meaning an unbroken lineage for 5,300 years. See is absolutely fascinating to me, I love that kind of stuff. You seen the site where you can view his tattoos in normal and UV light? Like 20 minutes. Like while they're still warm? I hope I've at least gone cold before I'm buried. Bloody dawdler. As an archaeologist I think this is a very weird question. As a grave robber I think this is a legit question. Answer: archaeologist. I'm an archaeologist, currently conducting postgraduate research focusing on early medieval trade in the North Atlantic, which is a fancy way of saying Viking fishermen. As others have said, it's not a matter of time as much as it is intent. Grave robbing is an unsanctioned, for-profit endeavor. Archaeology is a legally permitted, scientific examination for the purpose of understanding the past. Generally speaking, exhumation of recently interred remains for those purposes is forensic, rather than archaeological, despite similar methodology as it's usually conducted in the course of a criminal investigation. Contrary to the popular imagination, burial archaeology is probably only about 10% of the science, if that. Most of it is mundane shit like analyzing fishbone assemblages. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Literally for archaeologists. Finding a trash pit is a literal treasure in archaeology. I'm an archaeologist but I usually deal with human remains, but I've seen my colleagues so happy when they found a trash pit. I think that's how it's called in English, sorry not my first language. They have so much historical information stored. I'm an archaeologist. It depends on where you live. In the US, most, if not all states have laws prohibiting the purposeful disturbance of burials. This includes ones that are 2 years in the ground to 10,000 years. Native American burials are further protected by federal laws. If you're an archaeologist and you come across a burial on a site, you need to notify the county coroner, the local police, your state's historic preservation office, and potentially the local Native American tribe. They will make determinations as to its approximate age and if an investigation is needed, what happens to the remains, or if there is a possibility need for notification of next of kin. Then you dig it up. Most of the time, it's pretty straightforward and is dug up. Generally speaking, as an archaeologist in the US, you don't go looking for burials to purposely dig them up unless there is a good reason, since it triggers all sorts of laws and questions of ethics. Generally speaking, as an archaeologist in the US, you don't go looking for burials to purposely dig them up unless there is a good reason, since it triggers all sorts of laws and questions of ethics. This is true in Europe too. The reason why we have comparatively more modern archaeological excavation of human remains is because archaeological oversight of development projects is more strict, and because urban areas have generally seen continual development for at least 1,000 years or more. Until all the living relatives at the time of death are dead. But then Therese, the obvious problem of only children with no children themselves with few relatives, so Ike. That kind of makes sense. Maybe long enough so that no one alive knows that the grave was a relative. Exactly, then I guess you're not potentially hurting anyone living? It isn't time, it is intent. Grave robbing is to plunder the grave for valuables. Excavating an archaeological site is to learn. If you're opening the grave to make money, you're a grave robber. If you're spending money to open it, you're an archaeologist. Archaeology is just grave robbing with extra steps. Depends how many guns the people who have a problem with it have. I usually wait for the family to leave. It's a bit of a gray area, really. Most archaeology is developer-led these days. The only reason the site gets excavated is because it's going to be developed for housing, industry, quarrying, etc. In these cases, the site is going to be trashed, and full excavation is only done as a last resort to ensure features and finds are properly recorded, removed and stored before they are destroyed by heavy machinery. Most reputable archaeologists would recommend that things are best left in the ground and undisturbed if at all possible, regardless of age. So, on development sites, the age of the grave really doesn't matter, but speaking from experience, if it's wrapped in carpet, found in the topsoil, or has better trainers than me. As an archaeologist, I'm still calling the cops. Anything else gets excavated to the highest professional standards and treated with respect. Also, if it's been done for archaeology, you need a license to handle human remains. I guess grave robbers are not bothered by such red tape. I think the grave could be thousands of years old, it's still grave robbing if you're doing it to sell and for wealth and not under strict guided scientific theory. Like there's a big problem in Africa and the Middle East and even China where dudes dig up old graves with bulldozers and just sell that shit. I'd call them grave robbers. Back in the 19th century, archaeologists were just glorified grave robbers taking Egyptian artifacts back to their European museums. It's not a question of time, but rather a question of hats. Depends which side of the gunboat you're on. Well, at least it did. Hashtag X200B, grave robbers do it for the profit while archaeologists do it to preserve the past. Since archaeology is for the purpose of discovering the past, and not for personal profit, I'd say they are never the same thing. You could also be a grave robber of prehistoric artifacts. Archaeology is dedicated to preserving the finds and putting them into the right historical context. Grave robbers just want money. It's not about the time. If you open a grave and say this belongs in a museum, you're doing archaeology. Punching Nazis is also acceptable. As an anthropology student, TBH, I must say that it's a question that has no real answer. In my own opinion, funerary archaeology will always be grave digging, regarding of the time that passed. When Egyptologists find a new tomb in the Valley of King's Queens, they'll remove the belongings of the dead and even his bodies to expose them in a museum. Even if the person has been dead for 3,000 years, I think it can still be messed up to steal one's offerings and body to expose them to the masses. Because the removal of the artifacts and people from their tomb, the best archaeologists can do is record the context, stratum, disposition of artifacts, precise area on the site where it was found, in order that the grave itself is remembered as it was before it was disturbed. I actually worked on an archaeological excavation a few years ago where we dug up 3,000-year-old Mycenaean tombs in Greece. The biggest issue we encountered was that at night and during the off-season, winter months, grave robbers would come to dig up the tombs to steal the artifacts in them. Once we discovered tombs, we actually had to hire a night guard to watch over them while we weren't there. These robbers had actually stolen most of the artifacts discovered at the site from the late 20th century to now, and although most were lost, some gold seal rings were found and recovered at a metropolitan auction when a professor recognized them. Archaeology is the art of destruction. Every time you remove a stone or move dirt, you are destroying something that someone made. Archaeologists acknowledge this and dedicate their lives to noting every detail and cataloging everything that they find. All of this is done for the pursuit of knowledge. Their work is the foundation of our understanding of the ancient world. They usually have no money and their careers ahead of them are not easy. Looters are just in it to profit off it, and they can make a lot of money. Every time they remove an artifact, the artifact itself disappears forever just to end up in someone's private collection that they can't even show to their friends, and all the information vanishes with it because without context it's just another mysterious old thing.